Hello, Waswere here, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about the Necromancy combat style and how all the abilities interact with each other. I like to call this an introductory guide, as it's not going to go over every advanced rotation out there, but more helping you understand the priority of abilities as you do content, and how they can interact with each other to create the insane damage that you might be seeing from other players. There are an additional 2 resource systems that exist beyond Adrenaline with Necromancy. They are Necrosis Stacks and Residual Souls. Necrosis Stacks show up on your buff bar, and they are generated in 2 ways. You get +2 Necrosis Stacks for using the Necromancy basic attack under Living Death, which is the style's ultimate. And you also get 4 Necrosis Stacks for using the Touch of Death basic attack at any time. The maximum stack size of Necrosis is 12. You're able to spend these Necrosis Stacks by using the Finger of Death ability, which can spend 6 stacks to reduce the Adrenaline cost of Finger of Death to 0. Or you can use the T70 to T90 special attack from the Death Guard, which will spend all your remaining Necrosis stacks for extra damage. Residual Souls show up above your character as either empty or filled orbs. There is a base maximum of 3, but that can be increased to 5 when wielding the T95 offhand lantern. These are generated in multiple ways. First off, you get +1 Residual Soul every time the Soul Sap basic is used. And also, all the Spectral Scythe abilities, every time it hits, whichever target it hits, there's a 25% chance of gaining a Residual Soul and adding it to your collection. They can be spent on 2 different abilities. First is Soul Strike, which is an AoE that stuns the main target. This costs 1 soul. The other one is Volley of Souls, which is a heavy damaging single target attack that releases all souls at once. Okay, with that out of the way, it's time to get into the abilities. There are a total of 3 basic abilities in Necromancy: the generic basic attack, Touch of Death, and Soul Sap. The generic basic attack is Jagex's solution to complicated rotation with other styles, as it eliminates needing a 7 to 8 basic ability rotation, and you can instead primarily rely on this generic attack. It deals between 90 to 110% Necromancy ability damage, generating 9 Adrenaline per cast, but it is affected by the Invigorating perk, which provides extra Adrenaline to auto attacks. Having rank 4 in that will give 10.8% Adrenaline total. I should note that this ability has no cooldown, so you can just spam it over and over again. There are 2 other synergies to be aware of. First off, when Living Death is active, you gain 2 Necrosis stacks for every use of the auto attack. And then when using the T95 main hand Omni Guard, every 5th use of the ability will deal 2 times damage. Additionally, the special attack has the ability to make that happen more frequently, but more on that when I touch on the special attack in its own section. Next up is Touch of Death, which coincidentally deals the exact same average damage at 90 to 110% damage. However, it generates 4 Necrosis stacks. Because it does the same damage as the basic attack, generally if you have Touch of Death off cooldown and we're going to use the generic basic attack, you would use Touch of Death instead, as it also provides a passive buff to your character. One synergy to pay attention to is that when you're under the effect of Living Death, the style's ultimate, Touch of Death generates an extra 6% more Adrenaline, making it even higher priority over the generic basic attack. Soul Sap is the last basic ability, and it again deals 90 to 110% Necromancy damage. It generates 1 Residual Soul, which can be used to deal more damage later, making it better than the Necromancy basic attack. It also sports a short cooldown at 5.4 seconds, meaning it can be used every 3rd ability. As there is no interaction with Living Death, what I've noticed is that you use Soul Sap outside of Living Death to generate souls, and then when inside Living Death, you use the basic ability or Touch of Death to generate extra Adrenaline and Necrosis stacks. That was quick. The basics are done. I'm happy there's only 3 in Necromancy, and they each kind of have their own resource system to pay attention to. I much prefer this over the 10 that we normally get with range, magic, or melee. Next, let's talk about Conjures. These are very powerful, especially with their ability to pre-summon them. Summoning and commanding your Conjures may cost Adrenaline, but if you use them before a fight, then you do not have a target, and if you do not have a target, then they do not drain Adrenaline. This operates the same way that you can use Devotion prior to a fight, and it doesn't drain Adrenaline. This is incredibly powerful, because before a fight starts, you can conjure all 3 of the Skeleton, Zombie, and Ghost, and then activate the Ghost. The combined Adrenaline cost of this is 150%, but it will cost you none. For any piece of Necromancy combat, you will likely be doing this before entering the instance. There are currently 3 summons, the Skeleton, the Zombie, and the Ghost. The Skeleton is the first follower you unlock, and it's the weakest of the 3. It normally attacks every 3 seconds, dealing 27 to 33% Necromancy damage per hit. Additionally, the Skeleton gets 1% extra damage for every time it attacks, up to a maximum of 25% extra damage. It costs no adrenaline to summon. It can be commanded, again costing no adrenaline, causing it to attack every tick instead of every 5 ticks. This helps to build rage stacks quickly, as it will attack a total of 10 times over the course of the ability. The extra 8 hits represents an increase of 284 to 440% ability damage, depending on how many rage stacks were on the Skeleton when it was used. As it costs no adrenaline and provides a lot of damage, this can be used multiple times per fight. This synergizes well with the Ghost Conjure, which I'll talk about now. The Ghost Conjure is the single most broken part about Necromancy. Its base summon isn't too bad, being more of a support style character as it attacks every 4.2 seconds and deals 18 to 22% Necromancy damage, both of which are considerably less than the Skeleton, but it does heal the player for 175% of the damage done. Say the Ghost hits a 300, you would then heal a 525. The adrenaline cost to summon the Ghost is 30, but we like to ignore that cost by pre-summoning. On top of that, it can be commanded for 70% adrenaline, which provides the best buff in the game, Haunted. When commanded, every time that the Ghost attacks, it will place the Haunt debuff on its target. While under the Haunted debuff, the NPC will take 2 times damage, though it's capped at 35% of your base ability damage, which for me in max gear and 120 Necromancy is 767. Just think of that. Every single hit splat that you do is increased either by 2 times or by 767. Now think back to the Skeleton hitting 10 times when you command it, and each one of those hits will be increased by 767 for a total of about an 8k increase just from one ability. Also, this Haunt debuff will last until the Ghost dies, which can be well over a minute of 767 extra damage per hit. This is just insane, and it's such a cool part about Necromancy. Every ability is buffed by Haunt, but there are a couple ones worth mentioning where it'll work better than you might imagine. For Death Skulls, currently the 35% increase will apply on each bounce, so as it bounces from NPC to NPC, it gains more and more damage. By the 5th bounce, it's already been increased 5 times. Bloat is an ability that is a damage over time ability, consisting of 10 smaller hits. With Haunt, each of the 10 hits gets buffed by that 767 number. Volley of Souls, which is an ability that has up to 5 individual hit splats, are all individually boosted. So 5 hit spats, all getting that 35% increase. Lastly, the Zombie Conjure, which I'll talk about next, has a potential synergy with the Ghost, but it depends on if the target is poison immune or not. The Zombie Conjure costs 50% adrenaline and has 2 ways of dealing damage. First, it attacks with an auto attack, which deals 18 to 22% damage every 3.6 seconds. It's in the mid-range between the Skeleton and the Ghost DPS, but it also emits a cloud around it where any enemy inside it gets 27 to 33% poison damage every 1.8 seconds. This means that if the target is able to take poison damage, then there will be a hit splat every 1.2 seconds, and they will all be doubled by Haunt. You can also command the zombie to blow up and deal 360 to 440% necromancy damage at the cost of no adrenaline. This can be used if you have a large stack of AoE mobs that won't take poison damage. I personally haven't found much use for this past AoE XP training. Basics and Conjures are out of the way, let's go to the thresholds. I'm going to call them thresholds, but they really aren't. They function more as special attacks. Thresholds normally require 50% adrenaline to use and drain 15% adrenaline on cast, while Necromancy thresholds instead require a certain percentage of adrenaline to use and also have that same cost. For example, Bloat costs 20% adrenaline and requires 20% adrenaline to use. Blood Siphon is the first ability I'm throwing in this section, and I don't really know what to call it as it doesn't generate any adrenaline, but it also doesn't cost any or use another resource. It's an AoE style ability where you charge up in place, eventually releasing a big hit on your target, Enemies around your target will be dealt 22 to 28% necromancy damage per hit for a maximum of 4 hits. And that damage is added on to the final blast at the target. I haven't seen many bossing uses for this ability, but it could be a quick heal in a pinch where there are adds. This ability is really good for AFK training methods, as for something like Abyssal Beast, it represents a full HP heal every 45 seconds. Finger of Death is an ability that deals 270 to 330% necromancy damage and costs 60% adrenaline. This adrenaline cost can be reduced by 10% for each Necrosis stack used, up to a maximum of 6 for 0% adrenaline cost. The general rule of thumb I've found with this ability is that because Necromancy is so adrenaline starved, you never want to use the Finger of Death ability while you have less than 4 Necrosis stacks, as you will not be able to do other adrenaline costing abilities if you do. The Residual Souls have 2 threshold style abilities that can be used, but they do not cost you any adrenaline, only the souls as the resource system. Soul Strike costs 1 Residual Soul and does the following. It'll hit the main target for 135 to 165% necromancy damage, stunning and binding them for 3 seconds, while enemies within 1 tile of the target get hit with 90 to 110% necromancy damage. This ability is also impacted by the flanking perk, with flanking 4 making the main target take 351 to 429% damage, and the other targets take in the range of 250% damage. I'm not really sure how flanking can fall into the meta, as there is a large opportunity cost with using flanking, and switching is weird with no dyeable items right now, but having an additional T95 weapon with flanking might be useful in the future. However, it seems as though Volley of Souls may always be better due to the global cooldowns used. Soul Strike does have a really cool use case where you can stun lock monsters. Normally, a style will have 1 to 2 stuns that can be used and then they go on cooldown. But with Soul Strike, there is no cooldown. So if you have all 5 souls straight up, you can spam 5 straight Soul Strikes and stun lock your target. Most bosses are stun immune, but for the ones that aren't, like Telos, go ham with the stuns. Volley of Souls is the other use of your Residual Souls. It unleashes all the souls charged, hitting the target for 135 to 165% necromancy damage for each soul stored, at a minimum of 2 stored. As mentioned before, they are all individual hits. This synergizes very well with the Haunted debuff provided by the Conjured Ghost. Typically, how I've been using this ability is slowly storing up souls throughout the fight, and then when I hit an important DPS check, I release all the souls for a massive combined hit. Bloat on its face is an ability that doesn't seem that good, and that's because we all started using Necromancy in quick low-level combat where targets aren't alive for more than a couple seconds, but when Bloat has its time in the sun, it is very good. It deals 135 to 165% Necromancy damage on cast, and implies the Bloated debuff. This will hit them for 25% of the initial hit another 10 times, so a total of 337 to 410% damage extra. On top of that, it's a bunch of small hits, which means it synergizes really well with Split Soul and Haunted for some insane damage. When you have both of those things running, Bloat becomes nearly a 1000% ability. And it only costs 20% adrenaline. My advice for using Bloat is to use it when you have excess adrenaline and you still have at least 18 seconds left on the mob to get the full damage of the ability. It seems like it fits in a Living Death rotation very well. It also has an AoE effect where upon death to the main target, it will spread the blow to other targets that are nearby for an additional 4 hits. The last threshold style ability is the Spectral Scythe. It's a unique ability in that it transforms as you use it. The first cast is a Cleave-esque ability dealing 72 to 98% necromancy damage to targets in a cone in front of you, like Cleave does. This costs 10% adrenaline. The second cast is a Hurricane-esque ability, dealing 180 to 220% necromancy damage, hitting up to 9 additional targets within 2 squares of your players, this one costing 20% adrenaline. And the third hit is a Meteor Strike-esque ability, dealing 225 to 275% necromancy damage, hitting up to 9 additional targets within 2 squares of your player. This costs 30% adrenaline. Once all 3 have been casted, it goes on a 15-second cooldown. They all have a passive effect where each hit there is a 25% chance of generating a Residual Soul. I haven't had much use with this ability personally, as it drags you melee distance and I find that annoying, but for AoE style encounters such as Terracat or Elite Dungeons as a whole, this may be an incredibly powerful way to generate residual souls quickly, but in single target, I don't think it has much use in comparison with the other Necromancy abilities. Alright, let's talk about the ultimates. Death Skulls is impacted by the Zuck Cape, dropping its adrenaline cost down to 60% and making it more powerful. As Death Skulls represents a large portion of Necromancy damage, I highly suggest getting the Zuck Cape for Necromancy prior to bossing. It's not the end of the world if you don't have it, but it can really hamper you. Normally, Death Skulls will deal between 225 to 275% Necromancy damage and can bounce up to 4 times after its first target, so 5 hits maximum. But with the Zuck Cape, it can bounce an additional 2 times, up to 6, making the maximum number of hits 7. In single combat where there are no NPCs to bounce to, it can bounce to the player instead, but that does cost one of the bounces, so the maximum hits on the main target is 4 with the Zuck Cape or 3 without. The normal cooldown for this ability is 60 seconds, but while under Living Death, the cooldown is 12 seconds, and your rotations center around using Death Skulls 3 times in your ultimate. Death Skulls has some cool synergy with Living Death, the other ultimate, as when you activate Living Death, it resets the cooldown of Death Skulls and Touch of Death, alongside providing a buff to 4 abilities, which I've already mentioned. The Necromancy auto attack now generates 2 Necrosis Stacks, Touch of Death generates an additional 6% adrenaline, Finger of Death deals 1.5 times damage, and Death Skulls cooldown is reduced to 12 seconds. This lasts for 30 seconds and cannot be extended by Planted Feet. I will get into an example rotation later, but first, the special attacks and incantations. There are 2 special attacks currently for Necromancy, one that comes from the T70 to T90 Death Guard, and one that comes from the T95 Omni Guard. The Death Guard special attack deals between 405 to 495% Necromancy damage, stunning and binding the target for 4.8 seconds. And it also deals an extra 40% Necromancy damage for each Necrosis stack used, and when you cast this, it will consume all stacks you have left. This is a hard-hitting, low-cost ability that can be used to clear out 2 or 4 Necrosis stacks when you don't want to spend adrenaline on Finger of Death. It only costs 25% adrenaline, so when you have either 2 or 4 stacks, it's considerably better than Finger of Death, being less adrenaline and more damage. You will still want 2 copies of this special attack, one for inside the EOF, so you can use it with the T95 weapon, and one outside the EOF as a T90 for any boss that requires a Salva amulet such as Hermod or Rasial. For storing it in the EOF, you can use the T70 as the special attack is the same among all 3 tiers. The Omni Guard special attack deals between 360 to 400% Necromancy damage, which is less damage, but it has a pretty strong passive where it immediately readies Death Spark. Death Spark will cause your next Necromancy generic attack to deal 2 times damage, and any subsequent use of Finger of Death, Touch of Death, or Death Skulls will immediately ready Death Spark again, avoiding the need to use 5 basic attacks to build it back up. The adrenaline cost of this ability is 30% after the patch, making it pretty viable in most rotations. If you are under the effect of Living Death, you can easily only use a boosted basic or other strong abilities in a rotation. Now let's talk about the incantations. Greater Bone Shield lets you use defensive abilities without using a shield. This shield tier will be 50% of your Necromancy level, so at 100 Necromancy it's a T50 shield, but at 120 Necromancy it's a T60 shield. This is really nice as you can weave in abilities like Reflect or Resonance right in the middle of your rotation without having to swap to other gear. It costs 10 Spirit Runes, 10 Bone Runes, and 5 Flesh Rune per defense that requires a shield. So defensive abilities like Anticipate will not take runes. You do not need to activate this ability, it just stays on and only uses runes when you use a defensive. Threads of Fate is an incantation that acts as Greater Chain. Your next Necromancy ability that is casted will hit up to 4 additional targets within 4 squares of your main target. This can be used to either do big damage with a large hit, or generate additional residual souls as you will gain 1 for each target hit. It has a cooldown of 1 minute, so make sure to use it at the correct AoE moment. Life Transfer is an incantation that extends the duration of all your Conjures by an additional 20 seconds at the cost of half your maximum life points. This can be done when you have all 3 summoned, as it only takes 1 global cooldown to extend all your Conjures instead of spending another 3 global cooldowns to resummon them. This should be used during big damage periods where you're able to soul split up lost HP, as it can leave you vulnerable to death. The maximum extension of Conjures via Life Transfer is 60 seconds. Invoke Death is a really cool incantation that places the Death Mark debuff on the target on your next Necromancy attack. As far as I can tell, there is no time limit on this debuff, so as soon as the NPC has it, as long as you remain in combat with it, they will keep the debuff. What it does is that it will execute the target when it is below 20% HP. For high HP monsters, they didn't want this to be too overpowered, so it has a maximum damage of 30,000. As you can cast Invoke Death pre-fight, and then immediately place Deathmark on your target, you should be using this every time. Note that the T70 to T90 power armor set places the Deathmark debuff on your target as a passive, so if you're using that, you're unlikely to need to use Invoke Death at all. Darkness is the Animate Dead invocation. It's the defensive invocation that makes you take less damage. Instead of lowering the amount each hit does, it provides a flat 20% dodge chance. This means that every attack that is done to you has a 10% chance of dealing 0 damage. It's a passive, and you can wear any armor, so while using Necromancy, the only reason not to use it is the rune cost, as it costs about 100k per cast right now for a 4-minute duration. The last incantation is Split Soul. This replicates the Eldritch Crossbow special attack, where a Soul Split no longer heals you, but instead it deals damage to the target at 4 times the amount that you would have healed. Meaning if you are in a position where you don't need Soul Split heals, you can spend 1 global cooldown to deal a ton of extra damage over the next 20 seconds. Like Threads of Fate, this has a 60-second cooldown, so pay attention to when you're using it. I should note that Conjured damage is not affected by Split Souls, as it's a different category of damage. Alright, that is every ability, every incantation, every conjure gone over, and now it's time to put it all together into an actual rotation. And for this, I'm going to use Rasial rotation as an example. Go through a average kill, not like a super speedy kill, not a super slow kill, and understand the rotation I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So as soon as I get 100% adrenaline, I go through the portal and I do my 3 summons here. The Skeleton, the Ghost, and the Zombie. I also popped Darkness. This was pre-patch where it only lasted 4 minutes and cleared on teleport. So in actuality, it's going to be 12 minutes. So you won't need to do this every time. But once the Darkness is done, I enter the instance. Immediately conjure the Ghost and surge forward to the right square. At this point, I use the Invoke Death ability. Because there's still enough time left on it that by the time Rasial spawns, I'll be able to invoke him right away, so this is lossless. And then the last ability I do before starting the fight is the Command Skeleton, which is going to lead to some extra damage from that. All losslessly because the boss hasn't spawned yet. It also sets it up pretty perfectly to be able to target cycle and use Death Skulls as soon as the boss spawns. I do there. And the reason why you use Death Skulls first is that once you eventually Living Death, you're going to reset the cooldown of that, so you might as well get a use of Death Skulls before using your Living Death. And after this, I'm at 60% adrenaline, which means I'm going to need about 4 abilities to get back up to 100% to Living Death. And the best 4 ability combo here is going to be Soul Sap into Touch of Death, into a Necromancy auto, and then back into Soul Sap. These all do the exact same amount of damage, but we're just maneuvering around the cooldowns so that you get 2 Soul Saps and 1 Touch of Death. Instead, if you started with the Necromancy auto and then went to the Touch of Death and Soul Sap, your 4th ability would have to be the Necromancy auto again, losing out on that 1 soul. So let's see this in action. So I use Soul Sap, Touch of Death, Necromancy auto, and then Soul Sap. At this point, I'm 100% adrenaline, and I prepare myself for my ultimate. You want to ultimate with Living Death at the same time as you click on the Adren pot. That way you start getting the Adren right away, and your first 2 abilities after Living Death can be Touch of Death, as that cooldown was also reset, and then right into Death Skulls again with another reset cooldown. The Touch of Death extra adrenaline and the on-tick Adren pot is what makes this possible. Now at this point, you kind of can freeform a little bit. All you need to do is get yourself back up to 60% adrenaline by the time Death Skulls is off cooldown or 1 global cooldown later. So the next ability I do is Bloat, as it's very good. And with both Bloat and Death Skulls going, it's now an opportune time to start using Split Soul. So use Split Soul. I have 8 stacks, so I finger here. And now I'm just spamming the auto to get Adrenaline up and my Necrosis stacks. And eventually I get up to 60% Adrenaline, Death Skulls again. And now the rest of this is just going between fingering when I have over 6 stacks, using the Necromancy auto when I don't have 6 stacks, and then using Touch of Death whenever it's off cooldown. All the way until the boss gets to 200k, and dodging the mechanics. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way to 200k. And now the boss is 200k, and it goes to the end. This is outside the scope of the rotation topic I wanted to talk about, but we might as well finish off the kill here. And I go ahead and come over to the boss, and I want to use Death Skulls right away because it takes so long for Death Skulls to get going with the bounces. And then also, this boss hurts a lot right here, so I went ahead and prepared the Vit Pot into Reflect, and all the souls that we've been storing up over the course of the kill at times where you soul snap can now be released with Volley of Souls for a big damage hit. And then from here, you can freeform with the special attack from the Death Guard, your Skull's going, your Touch of Death, and that is a 52-second Rasial kill. So I hope this sort of introduction to a DPS rotation can help you a little bit. If you need to, watch that last part over again. Maybe you'll understand it a little bit better, because I was talking very quickly there. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you learned anything, leave a like, leave a comment, all that good stuff. Subscribe to the channel. These types of videos and every single screenshot and clip actually does take a really long time to put together. So I appreciate all the support I've been getting recently with my return to RS3 content, and I'm hoping that's going to continue into the future. Thanks, and have a good day.